Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dewey, the New York ISO has repeatedly raised strong concerns over our state's aggressive transition away from sources of energy like natural gas and towards, quote, renewables like wind and solar. In a 2023 report, the ISO stated it is important to note that commercially available technologies to provide dispatchable, non-emitting supply do not exist at scale at this time. Does the ISO's definition of dispatchable encompass the ramp-up time for this non-emitting supply mentioned in this and other reports?
Yes, it does. When we talk about dispatchable, emission-free resources, we are projecting the need and the necessity to have a resource that can both meet the state's climate legislation, which mandates a carbon-free electric system by 2040, as well as continuing to meet the dispatchability requirements of managing the grid. That gap, that resource, does not exist today. The technology does not exist today.
What impact does a longer ramp-up time for these sources of generation like wind and solar have on grid reliability in a state, particularly when we experience weather events like Winter Storm Elliott that hit my district in the winter of 2022?
It requires extensive planning. It requires a lot of focused attention on the planning models so that we are not caught surprised by those swings in weather. It requires us to have additional and subsequent resources on standby in case we get those forecasts wrong, so that we can quickly shift to fill in the gap that can sometimes surprise us if it happens too quickly.
Thank you. And as you point out in your testimony today, the 2024 to 2034 RNA directly implicates our state's own public policies and the concerns over declining reliability margins. Specifically, since the enactment of New York's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, more than twice the capacity of generation has been deactivated than has been added to the system. You go on in your testimony to mention how this transition is raising new challenges for grid reliability in the event of significant weather events. Mr. Dewey, has any oversight been conducted by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission into these reliability concerns voiced by New York ISO? And has FERC given any warning signals to the state of New York based on what seem to be very consistent concerns with reliability resulting from public policy choices?
We've had a lot of engagement and a lot of oversight with the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, which is the reliability arm of the FERC. They are predominantly the enforcement arm to make sure reliability criteria is met. We work very closely with them to make sure that the market rules that we develop, that we administer under the FERC tariffs, contemplate some of the changes that we're going to see on the electric power grid. So primarily that engagement is with NERC on reliability, and with FERC on the implementation of the market rules necessary to be able to meet those reliability criteria.
Okay. And on the subject of state-level policy choices impacting reliability and affordability, Mr. Van Wheely, in 2013 you testified before this committee that there were concerns in ISO New England that insufficient natural gas infrastructure would result in increased costs, increased emissions, and reduced reliability. You reiterated your testimony in 2017, and in today's testimony, you've stated that ISO New England gets more than 50% of its electricity from natural gas, yet it doesn't have enough natural gas pipeline capacity in the winter. With this history, Monday's Washington Post reports that electricity costs in New England are 40% more than in the rest of the country. Do you continue to have fuel security concerns? And would additional pipeline capacity sourcing domestic supplies to source sufficient natural gas lower costs for consumers and address fuel security concerns?
So the actions the states have taken in the last decade have mitigated some of the price effects of the gas constraint by essentially taking demand off the system. And they've done that through investment in generation and demand response and energy efficiency. But the long-run concern still is there. And to your point, I think the gas constraints have resulted in big costs every winter when it gets cold, and we've had to rely on LNG or oil. So I think the policy question for the states is how best to mitigate those effects. Their actions have have also focused on trying to add offshore wind into the mix, because that would be beneficial. To the extent offshore wind is delayed, I think the conversation will turn to what are the other possibilities. And so the options on the table would be additional pipeline infrastructure, the dual fueling that I mentioned, and I would say one thing Congress could help us with here is the Jones Act. So I saw an article just earlier this week that Puerto Rico is now finally getting domestic LNG shipped to it. It would be helpful if New England could access domestic LNG. We export it at $6 per million BTU, but we're having to import it at $35 to $40 per million BTU. So I think Congress, that's something they could help.
I'm sorry, the gentleman's time has expired.
Time has expired. Thank you, and I yield back.